Most people believe that when someone disappears from a relationship without warning, it's an impulsive decision. They assume it happened because of one argument, one misunderstanding, or one bad day. But that's almost never what actually happened. Here's the psychological truth that catches so many people off guard. By the time an empath walks away, they've often been leaving emotionally for weeks, months, or even years. The physical goodbye is simply the last step in a process that started long before anyone noticed. That sounds confusing because empaths usually aren't the people who create conflict. They're the ones who listen, forgive, compromise, and try to understand everyone else's perspective. They're the ones who give second chances when others would have already walked away. So why would someone known for compassion suddenly cut a person off without another conversation? The answer isn't that they stopped caring. In many cases, it's because they cared for far too long. Hey, have you ever noticed someone who seemed completely patient, always willing to work through problems, suddenly become impossible to reach? No dramatic goodbye, no emotional confrontation. Just silence. Most people interpret that silence as punishment. Others call it cold or immature. But here's what almost nobody realizes. Silence can sometimes be the final stage of emotional exhaustion rather than emotional anger. The human brain has limits. Emotional energy has limits. Trust has limits. And when those limits are crossed repeatedly, people don't always explode. Sometimes they simply disconnect. What's fascinating is that this isn't unique to empaths, but the process often looks very different because of the way they naturally process emotions, relationships, and responsibility. By the end of this video, you'll understand why someone who appears endlessly patient can suddenly become completely unavailable, why warning signs are often invisible until it's too late, and what this teaches us about emotional intelligence, healthy boundaries, and relationship dynamics. Because once you understand the psychology behind this behavior, you'll stop seeing these endings as random and start recognizing the patterns that were there all along. Let's begin with the first pattern that almost everyone overlooks. One of the biggest misconceptions about emotionally sensitive people is that they're constantly expressing how they feel. In reality, many empaths do exactly the opposite. Instead of immediately confronting problems, they often observe them. They notice changes in tone before anyone else does. They remember broken promises that others forget. They pick up on body language that doesn't match someone's words. They sense emotional distance long before it becomes obvious. At first, this heightened awareness can strengthen relationships. Empaths anticipate needs, offer support, and prevent conflicts before they grow. But there's also a hidden downside. Because they're so skilled at understanding others, they often become equally skilled at explaining away unhealthy behavior. Someone cancels plans repeatedly. They're probably overwhelmed. Someone speaks disrespectfully. They must be having a stressful week. Someone becomes emotionally unavailable. They're dealing with something they haven't shared. Notice what happens here. Instead of asking, how is this affecting me? They're asking, why might this person be acting this way? Compassion becomes the filter through which every disappointment is interpreted. For a while, this creates peace. But internally, emotional debt begins to accumulate. Imagine lending someone a small amount of trust every single day. One broken promise doesn't seem significant, neither does the second. But after dozens of small withdrawals, the emotional account becomes empty. The other person often has no idea this is happening because every issue was quietly absorbed instead of openly discussed. This creates one of the biggest psychological blind spots in relationships. People mistake silence for satisfaction. In reality, silence can simply mean someone has decided that explaining themselves no longer changes anything. The lesson isn't to become suspicious of everyone. It's to recognize that healthy communication requires both empathy and honesty. Understanding someone's struggles should never require ignoring your own emotional reality. And that leads directly to the next psychological pattern: why empaths often wait far longer than they should before walking away. Here's something that surprises many people. Empaths usually don't leave relationships quickly. In fact, they often stay much longer than logic would suggest. Why? Because they don't evaluate people based only on behavior. They also evaluate potential. They remember who someone was at the beginning of the relationship. They remember moments of kindness. They remember promises about the future. Their mind naturally searches for evidence that the relationship can return to what it once was. Psychologists sometimes describe this as investing in the possibility of change rather than responding to the reality of repeated patterns. This isn't weakness, it's hope. Hope can be one of the strongest forces in human behavior. It encourages forgiveness, patience, and resilience. But when hope becomes disconnected from observable actions, it can quietly trap someone in a cycle of disappointment. Have you ever noticed someone saying, "They're not usually like this"? That sentence often reveals a person who's comparing today's behavior with yesterday's memories instead of today's reality. Meanwhile, another psychological process begins. Every time an empath overlooks a hurtful interaction, they may unintentionally teach the other person that the behavior carries no meaningful consequence. Without realizing it, unhealthy dynamics become normal. Communication becomes inconsistent. Trust weakens. Respect fades in subtle ways. The relationship begins operating on emotional imbalance rather than mutual effort. Consider a friendship where one person is always available to help, but rarely receives the same support in return. At first, it feels manageable. Months later, the imbalance becomes emotionally draining. Yet, because the friendship has so much history, walking away feels almost impossible. But here's where everything changes. Empaths rarely leave because of one final event. The final event simply confirms what months or even years of accumulated experience have already taught them. The decision appears sudden to everyone else because they weren't present for the hundreds of invisible moments that led there. And once that internal decision is made, something remarkable begins to happen. Instead of trying harder, the empath starts becoming emotionally quieter, a shift that most people completely misunderstand. This is the stage where most relationships reach a turning point, yet almost nobody recognizes it while it's happening. People often expect emotional withdrawal to look dramatic. They imagine arguments, tears, or obvious frustration. But emotional detachment usually begins in much quieter ways. The empath stops volunteering personal stories. They stop asking as many questions. Their messages become shorter. Their excitement fades. Their energy changes before their words do. Here's what most people completely miss. This isn't always a strategy to get attention. More often, it's the mind protecting itself from repeated emotional disappointment. The brain is remarkably adaptive. When a certain interaction repeatedly produces stress, rejection, or emotional exhaustion, it starts conserving energy. Instead of investing more, it invests less. Think about someone who repeatedly reaches out to check on a partner or friend, but receives little interest in return. At first, they keep trying. Eventually, they begin asking themselves, why am I putting in all this effort if it isn't being valued? That question changes everything. Notice that nothing dramatic has happened. Yet internally, an important psychological shift has begun. Their focus slowly moves from changing the relationship to understanding themselves. This is where emotional intelligence starts replacing emotional endurance. Rather than convincing someone else to care, they begin asking whether they're respecting their own emotional needs. Body language often reveals this shift before words ever do. Their eye contact becomes calmer instead of eager. Their posture becomes more relaxed. They stop leaning into conversations that once mattered deeply. They smile politely, but the emotional investment behind those smiles has diminished. Many people misread this calmness as everything returning to normal. In reality, it can be the opposite. The conflict has disappeared because the expectation has disappeared. And when expectations disappear, emotional attachment often follows. That's why the final goodbye seems to come out of nowhere. By the time it happens, much of the emotional separation has already taken place. But if emotional exhaustion explains the withdrawal, what finally convinces an empath that it's time to leave for good? The answer lies in a psychological threshold that exists in every healthy relationship. People often think trust disappears in one catastrophic moment. Sometimes it does. But far more often, trust changes direction gradually. Trust isn't built only through honesty. It's built through consistency. Every kept promise tells the nervous system, you're safe here. Every broken promise sends a different message. Neither one feels life-changing on its own. Together, they become a pattern. Empaths tend to notice patterns more than isolated events. They're less interested in what someone says during an apology and more interested in what happens afterward. Does the behavior change? Does communication improve? Do actions begin matching intentions? Because words can comfort people temporarily, but consistent behavior creates lasting security. Imagine a relationship where one person repeatedly apologizes after hurting the other. The apologies sound sincere, the conversations feel productive. For a few days, everything improves, then the exact same cycle repeats. Over time, the empath starts trusting the pattern more than the promises. That's an important psychological shift. The brain naturally predicts the future, using repeated experiences from the past. Once enough evidence accumulates, hope slowly gives way to expectation. And if the expectation becomes disappointment, emotional investment naturally declines. This doesn't mean the empath suddenly stops caring. It means they stop expecting different outcomes from the same behavior. Almost nobody realizes how powerful this transition is. When trust changes direction, communication changes with it. Instead of asking for reassurance, they begin relying on observation. Instead of believing intentions, they begin believing habits. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition. Healthy relationships survive because both people notice unhealthy patterns and choose to change them together. Unhealthy relationships continue because one person keeps adapting while the other keeps repeating. Eventually, the empath reaches a realization that's uncomfortable but incredibly important. Love without mutual effort slowly becomes emotional labor. And that's where boundaries finally enter the picture. One of the biggest misunderstandings about empaths is the belief that when they cut someone off, they're trying to punish them. In many situations, the opposite is true. They're trying to protect themselves. Healthy boundaries aren't walls built to keep everyone out. They're filters that allow healthy relationships to remain healthy. The challenge is that many empaths confuse kindness with unlimited availability. They answer every call. They solve every crisis. They absorb everyone else's emotions while quietly ignoring their own. At first, this feels generous. But over time, generosity without limits often turns into exhaustion. Have you ever noticed how some people become accustomed to receiving support without ever asking how the other person is doing? Not because they're intentionally selfish, because constant availability slowly becomes the expectation. Human beings naturally adapt to whatever becomes normal. That's why boundaries can surprise people. When someone who's always available suddenly says no, it feels unexpected, even if that boundary is completely reasonable. Imagine a woman who spent years being the emotional anchor for her entire family. She's the first person everyone calls during a crisis. Yet when she's struggling, very few people check on her. Eventually, she realizes she's carrying relationships that should have been shared responsibilities. Her decision to step back isn't fueled by revenge, it's fueled by balance. She isn't ending relationships because she hates the people involved. She's ending the version of herself that believed constant self sacrifice was the price of being loved. Here's where it gets interesting. People who benefited from weak boundaries often experience strong boundaries as rejection, but emotionally healthy people experience them as clarity. That difference explains why the same decision can strengthen one relationship while ending another. And once an empath discovers what healthy boundaries feel like, returning to old patterns becomes much harder than most people expect, because the greatest transformation isn't learning how to leave. It's learning that peace can be more valuable than constant emotional struggle. At this point, something changes that surprises almost everyone around the empath. For years, they may have spent countless hours explaining themselves. They carefully chose their words, tried to avoid misunderstandings, and gave people every opportunity to see things from their perspective. They believed that if they could just communicate more clearly, the relationship would improve. Then one day, they stop explaining. Many people interpret this as giving up. In reality, it's often the result of a deeper realization. Emotional intelligence teaches us that communication only works when both people are equally committed to understanding each other. If one person is listening while the other is only waiting to respond, the conversation becomes an endless cycle rather than a solution. Have you ever noticed that some discussions seem to repeat themselves over and over, even though nothing actually changes? That's because information isn't the problem anymore. The willingness to apply it is. Imagine someone who has expressed the same emotional need 10 different ways over several months. They've remained calm, patient, and respectful. Yet every conversation ends with temporary reassurance, followed by the same behavior. Eventually, they recognize a difficult truth. They aren't being misunderstood because they explained poorly. They're being unheard because lasting change requires more than words. This realization shifts their priorities. Instead of chasing closure, they begin protecting their peace. Their confidence becomes quieter. They no longer feel the need to convince everyone that their decision makes sense. They accept that not everyone will understand their boundaries, and that's okay. This is where emotional maturity begins to replace emotional dependence. The goal is no longer winning an argument. The goal is creating a life where constant arguments are no longer necessary. And once that inner peace becomes familiar, another fascinating psychological change begins to unfold. Ironically, the moment many people finally recognize an empath's value is after the relationship has already ended. Why does this happen? Because human psychology often notices consistency only after it's gone. Think about everyday life. We rarely think about electricity until there's a power outage. We rarely appreciate silence until we're surrounded by noise. Relationships work in much the same way. When someone consistently provides emotional support, patience, encouragement, and understanding, those qualities gradually become part of the background, not because they're unimportant, because people naturally adapt to what they receive regularly. Then the empath leaves. Suddenly, no one is checking in. No one is calming difficult conversations. No one is remembering birthdays, asking thoughtful questions, or noticing subtle emotional changes. The absence becomes louder than the presence ever seemed. Here's what most people completely miss. They're not necessarily missing the relationship itself. Sometimes they're missing the emotional stability that relationship quietly provided. This realization often creates regret. The person who once ignored small acts of kindness now remembers every one of them. The conversations they rushed through suddenly replay in their mind. The opportunities they assumed would always be there no longer exist. But here's an important lesson. Regret alone doesn't rebuild trust. Trust grows through consistent action over time, not through sudden emotional realizations. That's why healthy relationships don't rely on people learning lessons after loss. They rely on appreciation before loss ever becomes necessary. This applies to everyone, not just empaths. If someone consistently contributes peace, respect, honesty, and emotional safety to your life, don't wait until they're gone to recognize their value, because sometimes the greatest relationship mistake isn't a dramatic betrayal. It's quietly taking someone's emotional presence for granted until it's no longer there. And that brings us to perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. It's easy to watch a story like this and conclude that the answer is simply to remove difficult people from your life. But that's only part of the picture. The deeper lesson is about self-awareness. Every relationship teaches us something, not only about others, but about ourselves. Empaths often discover that compassion without boundaries leads to burnout. Others may discover that receiving kindness without reciprocating slowly weakens trust. Still others realize they avoided difficult conversations because they assumed love alone would solve problems. Healthy relationships require more than good intentions. They require emotional responsibility. That means paying attention to behavioral patterns instead of isolated promises. It means noticing body language that communicates respect or indifference. It means asking difficult questions before resentment quietly replaces honesty. Have you ever noticed how the strongest relationships aren't usually the ones without conflict? They're the ones where both people are willing to grow through conflict. Confidence isn't refusing to apologize. It's being secure enough to change when change is needed. Influence isn't controlling someone else's behavior. It's creating an environment where honesty feels safe. Trust isn't built through grand romantic gestures. It's built through hundreds of ordinary moments where actions consistently match words. Whether you identify as an empath or not, these principles apply to every meaningful relationship you'll ever have. The healthiest people don't become emotionally unavailable. They become emotionally intentional. They stop giving endlessly and start giving wisely. They stop assuming and start communicating. They stop chasing validation and start choosing relationships where respect naturally flows in both directions. Because the strongest connection you'll ever build isn't based on sacrifice. It's based on mutual understanding, accountability, and genuine emotional safety. If there's one idea to remember from today's discussion, it's this. People rarely leave meaningful relationships because of one single moment. More often, they leave after hundreds of small moments that quietly reshape how safe, respected, and valued they feel. For empaths, this process is often invisible because they spend so much time observing, understanding, and giving others the benefit of the doubt. By the time they finally decide to walk away, the emotional journey has already been unfolding for much longer than anyone realized. But this isn't just a lesson about empaths. It's a lesson about all of us. Ask yourself, how do I respond when someone shares their feelings with me? Do I listen to understand, or do I listen to defend myself? Am I noticing the small daily behaviors that build trust, or am I only paying attention when something goes wrong? The answers to those questions shape every relationship in our lives. Real emotional intelligence isn't about reading minds or predicting behavior. It's about recognizing patterns, taking responsibility for our actions, and creating relationships where both people heard, respected, and emotionally safe. The more carefully you observe people, not to judge them, but to understand them, the better you'll become at recognizing healthy dynamics. avoiding unnecessary conflict, and building stronger connections. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: protecting your peace doesn't require becoming cold. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you care less. Sometimes the healthiest decision isn't walking away from people. It's walking toward a version of yourself that values mutual respect, honest communication, and emotional balance. When you build relationships on those foundations, you don't have to wonder where you stand. The consistency of people's actions will tell you everything you need to know. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about relationship psychology, human behavior, emotional intelligence, and communication, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay self-aware, and remember, the strongest relationships aren't built by perfect people. They're built by people who are willing to grow together